Thank you to everyone for making time in your day to come and visit IFPRI. As Klaus mentioned, every year the Global Hunger Index is presented in relation to another important issue, and this year it happens to be gender inequality. In this issue of the Global Hunger Index, we examine more closely the links between gender inequality and global hunger. And this builds on IFPRI's work over the past decade and a half, which shows the gains to eliminating gender disparities. So the Gender Gap Index was not developed by IFPRI. It was developed by the World Economic Forum in 2006 to increase awareness of the challenges that result from gender disparities and to contribute to effective measures to reduce this gap. Like the GHI, it is generated annually, and in fact, the 2009 Gender Gap Index report has just been released. It examines the gap between men and women in 115 countries in 4 categories. I'm not going to go into the methods underlying the Gender Gap Index, but I just want to point out what these 4 categories are. They're economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. Like any index, it has its shortcomings, especially the database on which it has been constructed. But nevertheless, we take that and try to see what we can tease out by looking at relationships between the Gender Gap Index and the Global Hunger Index. So what is important to remember with the Gender Gap Index is that it is a measure of differences between men's and women's levels of outcomes. Okay? It's not necessarily based on inputs, because we all know that richer countries have more resources to devote to, say, education, but rather the outcomes that have been achieved. So the way that the Gender Gap Index has been set up is that the highest possible score is 1, which implies perfect equality, while the lowest possible score is 0. For the GHI, as you've seen on the temperature scale, high numbers mean you have a higher fever, it's bad, and lower numbers are good. So because the scales are scaled differently, a negative correlation implies that greater hunger is associated with greater gender inequality. So it's worse if it's more negative. We do not have data on all the countries for the GGI nor the GHI, so we are computing correlation coefficients for the 90 countries for which data on both are available. Okay, so this graphs the strength of the correlation between the 2009 Global Hunger Index and the sub-indices of the 2008 Gender Gap Index. The reason that we decided to split up the components of the Gender Gap Index is that we wanted to identify what component of gender inequality is most crucial to global hunger. What you will see, first of all, is that there is a strong negative correlation between the Gender Gap Index and the Global Hunger Index. That means higher degrees of gender inequality contribute to higher global hunger. Okay. And this is statistically significant. The biggest component of the correlation comes from the education sub-index. So educational inequality between men and women is the most highly correlated with global hunger in the 90 countries we have looked at. We also have a strong negative correlation between the health sub-index and the education sub-index, but the education sub-index is much larger in terms of magnitude. Now, if you were to plot, for example, the education sub-index and the GHI, you would see this strong negative correlation coming out. But as Klaus said, what do averages hide? And what the Global Hunger Index graph hides is that the experience of hunger and gender inequality is quite different across regions. And that is because the context in which gender inequality plays out is very culture and context specific. So what we did is to look at these correlations by region and try to tease out what are the important entry points for policy which can both reduce gender inequality and reduce global hunger. In South Asia, the strongest correlation with the GHI is with the Health and Survival Subindex. In Klaus's graph earlier on, you saw that a large portion of the GHI came from the proportion of underweight children. And if you were going to look at the the gender gap index, you would see that with the exception of Sri Lanka, which is clearly an outlier in South Asia, 4 out of 5 countries rank between the 80th and 88th of 90 countries in the Health and Survival Subindex. And this is very intimately linked with the low status of women in South Asia. Anybody who does development work in South Asia knows that there is a very strong history of gender discrimination in South Asia, which takes its toll on women and girls. And you can really see that maternal malnutrition is linked with low birth weight of children, and micronutrient malnutrition of the mother is linked with poor prenatal and postnatal health of mothers. So in a situation where a woman is not empowered to take care of herself, she is not empowered to take care of her own children either. In sub-Saharan Africa, the correlation which is strongest with the GHI is in education. And less than a quarter of countries in the region met the MDG goal of gender parity in primary and secondary enrollment rates in 2005. So it's not so much in health and survival, although that's also important. The biggest contributor is education. And finally, in Middle East and North Africa, those green countries above the Sahara, where you have lower levels of hunger, even though the levels of hunger are lower compared to South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, we still observe a strong negative relationship between hunger and gender inequality. And the main driver here is educational inequality. As Klaus said, doing something like the Global Hunger Index immediately exposes you to media interviews. And without fail, what people have asked me is it the fact that women have low education that leads to their not being able to provide for their children? And I say, wait, that's not the correct question. The correct question is that it's not women's low levels of education, but the gap between their education and their husband's education. So I shamelessly borrow this sign from the London Underground because you really have to mind the gap. It's not the fact that women have low levels of schooling, but the fact that because they have low levels of schooling relative to their husbands, they don't have enough bargaining power within their households to mobilize the resources they need for their own and their children's health and nutrition. So therefore, the key policy message here is that you do have to close the gap. So first, you need to close the gap in education and in health. One might say, we already know that. There have been so many things going on in terms of improving girls' schooling, using various methods to send girls to school. Fine, that work must go on. It should not stop. Even though it's a long-term solution to ending global hunger, it should not stop. And many of the things that we have known for a while, like reducing costs to parents, are still important. We just need to try new ways of doing them. So using, for example, conditional cash transfer programs which are designed for the particular cultures and contexts in which they are being implemented, improving the quality, the gender balance, and the attitudes of teachers, making schools safe for girls. In many cases, schools are very unsafe because teachers may pick on girl students. Reducing time costs for girls by providing infrastructure so they don't have to fetch water or firewood, providing childcare so that older sisters can go to school instead of minding their younger siblings. The second gap that has to be closed is in health and survival, and this means that we need to invest in women's and girls' health and nutrition over the life cycle and to build support for women's empowerment in communities. I think we have often underestimated how important community support is for a woman being able to take charge of resources to, say, bring her child to the doctor when the doctor is sick. We've found, for example, in our work in Bangladesh, that mothers who had experienced domestic violence in the past had children who had poorer nutritional status compared to women who did not experience domestic violence. So empowering women really enables them to take action on behalf of their children. We also need to close the gap in economic and political participation. And you might wonder why this correlation is not that strong. Perhaps you would have expected it to be stronger. Part of it is because the data on which the gender gap index was based in the economic sphere is probably not as strong or as that in the health and survival and the education sphere. Nevertheless, there are things which can be done to reduce gender gaps in economic participation and opportunity. One is to remove barriers to labor market participation. And another one, obviously, is to strengthen women's property rights to land and other assets. There are still many countries where there are legal prohibitions against women obtaining loans in their name or owning assets in their own name, etc. And lastly, we need to reform legal systems to eliminate gender discrimination and to increase political participation. This includes the reform of statutory laws and constitutions to disallow discrimination, to improve women's voice and participation at local levels, not just in the stratosphere of society when you're looking at ministers and presidents, but in the local level so that women can actually participate, for example, in local governance units, and to improve legal awareness. Unless women and poor people are aware of the provisions of the law, they cannot use that law as their guarantee when they have to demand their rights. So thank you very much.